Warm February greetings to you all, MAI friends from around the globe. Good very early morning here in Chicagoland. Good afternoon or good evening to the rest of you in various places. This is Ramon Rocha of Media Associates International. We are glad that you have joined us live for today's webinar, Skills to Excel in Developmental Editing. I'll let our speaker, Owen Salter from Melbourne, Australia, to greet everyone as well. Owen, please greet our friends.
Well, it's an early morning in Chicago, but it's a lovely, balmy 8 p.m. summer evening here in Melbourne. So I say welcome too from me to everybody. I'm glad that we can share in this family of MAI and of the hope that some of the things that we talk about today really will be useful to you in your work.
Yes. Owen, we thank God for having 114 from 32 countries who registered for this webinar. The topic has drawn a lot of interest, and I think people see the importance of the role of the editor in making one's manuscript more prepared for publication, increasing one's chances of success, as it were. Just a quick reminder of our simple webinar house rule. Please interact with us, and actually you can interact with each other using the chat. And please type in your questions anytime, even during the presentation. You can type in your questions using the Q&A. And we will address your questions after the presentation. So, you've heard this before and we'll say it again. Every writer needs an editor. If you are a writer, remember that the editor is your friend, not your enemy. He or she is there to help you and to come alongside you. If you're an editor, please be a good friend to the writer. A true friend does not always say yes, right? Learning the skills in developmental editing will certainly help you become a better friend to the writer. Our speaker today, Owen Salter, has been in the business of writing and editing for more than 40 years. He established his own company called Barnabas Editorial Services and Training in 2007. And what an apt name for an editorial services company, Barnabas. Owen is currently serving as a board of trustee of MAI-Asia, and he has made himself available to be tapped as an resource person for editor and writer training for MAI since 2005. Thank you, Owen, for leading our webinar today. So please take it away.
Thank you, Ramon. And as I said before, very privileged and welcome to everybody who, wherever you are in the world. I just love and enjoy these webinars so much. It's the first time that I've presented one, but I have watched many and enjoyed the pooling of wisdom from across the world, different experiences and different cultures, different aspects of the publishing industry. So I hope that today you'll find that there's something here for you, whether you're an editor or a writer. Indeed, some of the things we'll be talking about today are things that writers can take on board in terms of looking to improve their own manuscripts, self-editing, or they're things that editors can bring to serve writers. I loved what Ramon said about being a writer's friend. And we often say that an editor is like a handmaiden, there to serve the writer. So that's the spirit that I want to come to today's session with. This webinar is called Skills to Excel in Developmental Editing. And I guess the first thing to say is that we can't cover everything about developmental editing in one webinar. We're going to focus on three particular issues or three areas that frequently require attention when you're developing a book-length manuscript. Now, I think Ramon has sent out to you some supplementary notes that I prepared, which goes into some more really very practical detail about applying some of these things. Today, the webinar itself will be talking about principles. There's some thoughts in that material about practical application, and also some thoughts in areas that we won't cover today. Practically, what attitude should you bring when you come to a developmental edit as an editor? What questions should you ask as you begin? How do you work out what's a good way to work with a writer? Because every writer is different. Some of those questions are in that extra material. And I'll also have 3 helpful MAI videos, which cover some of the material that we've been talking about, that hopefully will complement what we discussed today, and I'll give you the names of those at the end. Also, I wanted to say that we're talking about developmental issues with a draft manuscript. There's an aspect of developmental editing which takes place before the writer writes the first draft. So an editor might come alongside, give them advice, help them organise their ideas, plan out a chapter structure, and so on and so forth. That's an incredibly important and valuable part of developmental editing. It's not what we'll talk about today. Today we're talking about actually what you do with a manuscript which is in first draft form. It's not ready yet, it's not finished, it needs more development. So how do you work with the author to encourage that development? I'm just going to call up now my PowerPoint. Skills to excel in developmental editing. So an outline of today's webinar. Well, first of all, we'll define developmental editing and where it fits into the editing process. Then we'll clarify the goal of developmental editing. We'll identify the focus of developmental editing. And we'll look at 3 principles to help you tackle 3 of the big issues in developmental editing. So we start with what is developmental editing and where does it fit in the editorial process? This is the editorial process that we often experience. Manuscripts written by the author, it comes in and it's fed into the editorial team, or perhaps it's one person. And we normally say that there's a stage of editing, or a part of editing, an aspect of editing, which deals with content, structure, stylistic editing, like the writing style, grammar and things. It's often called substantive editing or line editing. And then there's copy editing, which deals with all the fine details. Developmental editing takes place before that main editing process. Now, not everyone has this step in their editorial process, but if you can build it in, it's a chance to shape the overall contours of a book before it gets into the main editorial process. As I mentioned before, developmental editing may take place before the first draft. For example, an editor might help an author organise their ideas, develop a chapter structure, identify distinctive emphases that the author needs to play up so that the book has a distinctive contribution, and so forth. Developmental editing may also take place after the first draft. An editor interacts with the author to strengthen the manuscript through revised drafts. And they can do this either in person, like personal discussion, perhaps a Zoom meetings, sitting and working through the manuscript together, or perhaps through sections of the manuscript. They can do it in writing, for example, with an exchange of emails, or a written report with suggestions and recommendations. They can do it through manuscript annotations, either by hand or using track changes and comment notes on the file, or a combination of all of those. I frequently use a combination of those different approaches. The goal of developmental editing is to serve the author by helping them to see how they can make their manuscript stronger, clearer, and more effective. And notice that I said serve the author. Ideally, developmental editing is an interactive process between editor and author. The editor brings their expertise to bear to identify ways the manuscript can be strengthened and improved. Then the author actions those suggestions, or not, if they choose not to. And often, authors may not like the suggestions an editor makes. And that's part of the negotiation, but in the end, the author has the right to accept or reject what the editor suggests. It's not about the editor laying down the law and saying things must be done in a certain way. It's about helping the author get more from themselves. My favourite quote about writing comes from C.S. Lewis. The way for a person to develop a style is A, to know exactly what he wants to say, and B, to be sure he is saying exactly that. Now, often in a first draft, writers are still trying to work out exactly what they want to say, and they haven't thought much about how to say exactly that. So a developmental editor will help them to say exactly what they want to say in a way that communicates effectively with the readers. The focus of developmental editing is that it deals with the big picture, the whole forest rather than the trees, if you like. The developmental edit may comment on the trees, that is the small picture issues like writing style, grammar, punctuation and things. If these are particular issues, if there are particular issues in these areas, they crop up generally across the manuscript. For example, I had a manuscript recently that someone sent to me, and every time a speech attribution, where the writer wrote, he said, he replied, she answered, whatever, the writer's style was to put that before the spoken language. But in that case, the convention is that the word said, replied, and so on should have a comma after it. And throughout this manuscript, there was no commas after the speech attributions. And so I was able to give a general comment on that punctuation issue, advising them to modify that. But generally, a developmental issue isn't a time to attend to those kind of fine details. Now, this is actually counterintuitive for a lot of editors because editors tend to be detailed people. And we just kind of want to get in there and get our hands dirty with the manuscript and fix everything. And really, developmental editing requires us to take a step back from that natural inclination. If that's our natural space, our natural inclination, take a step back and say, I need to concentrate at the macro level before I can concentrate at the micro level. Put it another way, we can think of a manuscript as being like a house. Developmental editing assesses a manuscript's overall plan, that is, looking at the manuscript as a total entity, a total thing, at its underlying foundations and its framework. Are they sound? Has anything been left out of the plan? Is the framework sturdy? It also assesses in a general way the author's construction standards. Are the bricks well laid? Is the floor level? Is the plumbing working? If there are general issues about the way the writer writes, they can be addressed at this level without going into too much detail. You might have heard the old joke, how many editors does it take to change a light bulb? The answer, only one, but first they have to rewire the whole building. Well, a developmental edit is really about working out whether the building needs to be rewired and then helping the author know how to tackle the job. Now, some manuscripts are wired like this and some are wired like this. There may be a limit to what an author can do to sort out the problems or to improve their manuscript. They may not have the time or the ability to take it further, or they might not be willing. This is often the case, particularly with amateur writers, if you're dealing with people, perhaps pastors, for example, who want to write a book. They're not professional writers, and they may not actually have the skill level to take a manuscript to the next stage. So like a doctor assessing patients, an editor has to triage the problems in a manuscript to work out what the author can do and what the editor will need to do. And one thing that it's important in a developmental edit is to try and not overload an author. Because particularly with non-professional authors, even simple suggestions can sometimes feel overwhelming. And especially if they've poured their heart and soul into the manuscript in the way that it is already, to be told that it needs more done to it can be quite threatening and difficult. So this is where the editor needs sensitivity, diplomacy, empathy, coming alongside and saying, this is the goal is for us to improve this. It's not to be critical for its own sake. It's not to be picky and grabbing onto lots of little problems. It's to say, how can we together find a way to make this stronger? So what are the issues that a developmental edit tackles? Every manuscript is unique with its own development challenges. And of course, different kinds of books raise different kinds of challenges. Like developing, say, a devotional book is different from developing a Bible commentary. But similar big picture development issues commonly crop up in many kinds of manuscripts. I'm going to outline three big principles, and they're captured in these three pictures. Three big principles that can be applied to many kinds of books. First one is the maypole. Second is the map. And the third is the stepping stones. And these images are helpful because they focus our attention on some of the main areas where first draft manuscripts frequently fall short. Areas of, does the manuscript have a core? Is it well focused? Has it got a unity? Issues of the trajectory through the manuscript. Does it keep moving? Is it consistent as it moves? Is there a sense of momentum as it travels? And issues of flow and connection. Is it disjointed? Does it make sense? And so on. So the first principle is the maypole principle. And that simply stated is everything must revolve around a core. Maypole dancing is part of the celebrations to mark the beginning of summer in many European countries. So school children dance around the maypole and weave the ribbons into a pattern around the pole. Now, there are three key elements in a maypole dance. Number one, everything revolves around the pole. Number two, all the ribbons are attached to the pole. And number three, the dance is carefully choreographed to produce the desired effect. Now, this principle of the maypole is absolutely critical in a book. It's a principle of having a central core concept or purpose, that is a maypole, around which all the content, the ribbons, revolve. This applies at multiple levels. A book overall needs a maypole, a central theme, and everything in the book should connect to that theme, like the ribbons connected to the pole. The dance is the way the author weaves the content carefully around that central idea. Similarly, each chapter needs its own central theme, which in turn is connected to the book's central theme. If the book is divided into parts, then each part needs its own central theme as well. Here's an example of a book with a clear central pole, a clear maypole. How to Talk So Little Kids Will Listen, a survival guide to life with children ages 2 to 7. I don't think anybody who sees that cover and reads the title will be in any doubt about what that book is about. Everything in there that you read will be trying to tell you and inform you, equip you as a parent of young children. Here's another book that's got a clear maypole, The Jesus I Never Knew. It's a book about Jesus, yes, but it's more than that. It's a book about rediscovering Jesus. It's a book about finding Jesus in ways that the author had never found before. We have just a quick look at the contents page. It gives us a clue. You see here that the book is divided into 3 parts. Each part has its own maypole. And each chapter has its own maypole. So everything in this chapter here will be about the consideration of Jesus' birth. There won't be in here anything about his parables, or they may be mentioned, but they won't be a focus. And they'll only be mentioned if they're relevant to the central core purpose of that chapter. And then just as the chapters will connect to the central core of that part, each of the parts will connect back to the central core purpose of the book. So let's break this down just a little. The first question to ask in a developmental edit is, does the manuscript have a maypole? That is, does it have a clear central idea? Alice Kreider is one of the speakers in one of the videos that I'll refer you to later. She's an American editor. Alice Kreider calls this the book's big idea. A book's maypole represents its distinctive focus. A manuscript needs to convey a clear vision of what will make the book stand out. That core idea and distinctive focus need to come through clearly from the beginning and stay in view throughout the manuscript. So questions that the editor can ask of a manuscript. Does the manuscript as a whole have a clear and distinctive central focus, a big idea? Is the core theme set out clearly early on? Does the manuscript keep the central focus? We don't want authors wandering off onto their hobby horses and getting on their soapboxes. Does each chapter, not just the book as a whole, but each chapter, have a clear central focus? The next question is, are all the ribbons connected to the maypole? That is every part of the manuscript somehow connected to the central big idea? At a chapter level, is each chapter integrated around its own core focus? And is the maypole of the chapter the main criterion for choosing the content? Content should be included or excluded according to whether it adds to the chapter's central focus. Now, the central focus, the central core may be broken down into all sorts of different topics and themes that throw light on that core, like multicolored ribbons in the dance. Now, these themes might be quite diverse, but all of them, the author needs to make sure that all of them are somehow woven together to decorate and add to and give light to that central pole. So there are questions we can ask. Does the core focus of the book or chapter guide the selection of content? In other words, is there anything superfluous that needs to go out? Does the author connect the content to the core focus? Is some material dead wood that needs to be cut out? The next question is, of course, is the dance choreographed well? Different kinds of dances can be done around a maypole, but they're all choreographed, they're not chaotic. What you want to see is an author being a choreographer. You want to see them deliberately weaving a dance that wraps the ribbons around the core big idea in a way that's attractive and effective. So we can ask, does the author intentionally weave ideas together, building up support for the book's or the chapter's core themes? Now, manuscripts can be comparatively straightforward like this one with only a few strands, or they can be monstrously complicated, but either way, they may be somewhere in between, of course. But regardless of that, there are several ways that an editor can apply the maypole principle to help an author produce a well-focused, revised draft. An editor can help identify the book and the chapter maypoles, as well as important contributing themes, and can encourage the author to bring those out more than they have. An editor can help identify a book's distinctive contribution and help the writer to highlight that. Authors often bury their best material or haven't thought it through thoroughly. An editor can help an author stick to the core focus. Sometimes, as it were, ribbons get disconnected from the maypole. That is, the author kind of goes off at a tangent or introduces something irrelevant, or sometimes the ribbons get all tangled. The ideas are there, they're all connected to the main idea, but they're all twisted and disordered. Or sometimes, again, there might be a problem with the dance. Perhaps the structure of a chapter is unsuitable, or the author stumbles partway through the manuscript and forgets the steps or loses their way. An editor can help sort these things out. An editor can also help an author overtly connect the ribbons to the maypoles. Authors often see the connections in their minds, but they fail to spell them out on the page. Or they go round and round a point, but they don't actually state it. Lastly, an editor can make suggestions about content, perhaps suggestions about removing or modifying content that's not related to the core purpose. Perhaps suggestions about rewriting content to clarify its relevance, or suggestions about how material can be used more effectively, or areas where the content needs more development. And here's an example of a book that I worked with an author on. It went through 5 drafts. And in the course of that, these are the things that happened. The central focus of the book was refined. There was a lot of stuff in there, quite a bit of stuff about philosophical questions about editing, but the author really wanted it to be pastoral. And so a lot of that stuff went out, and we focused down onto the pastoral concerns. We rearranged and reorganized chapters. I suggested a more effective use of stories. He has some fabulous stories, but they're often buried halfway through chapters. Sometimes that's the right place for them, but several times we elevated them right up to the beginning of chapters as a way to really hook readers into the content of that chapter. Suggested new material to add value. In the first draft of the manuscript, the author kept saying that we need to respond like Jesus when people are suffering around us. He said we need to express the love of Jesus, respond with the compassion of Jesus, adopt a Jesus-like attitude. Yet nowhere did he actually describe Jesus' approach. I suggested to readers that readers needed to see Jesus, what Jesus did, as a model. He wrote that material and it was so valuable. It added a whole new, valuable, excellent section to that book. And the last point there, in the process of doing this, we lost 37,000 words. It was nearly 100,000 words. We brought it down to around 60, which made it a much more publishable book. These are the kind of things that you're looking to do in a developmental edit. So the second principle is the MAP principle. Simply stated, plan a clear journey and stick to it. Now, most people like to travel and see new places. Europe is a popular destination. Now, Europe's a big place, though. You can't visit it all, so you have to break it down into countries. But countries are still pretty big places. So you have to break it down further, visit particular locations. In other words, you have to tackle it in a manageable way. You have to take a tour. A book is like a guided tour. The readers are the travellers and the author is the tour guide. Good tour guides know the territory that will be travelled and how to guide the travellers along the route. They know all the places to visit and the things worth seeing, and they organise the tour so that the travellers can relax and take in the sights. Now, a tour moves from destination to destination, and at each destination, the travellers stop and have a look around. So the travellers looking around at this, at the scenery, at the museums, whatever it is there. Then they move on to the next city and they look around all those places there. Well, a book is the same. A book should move from a departure, and then each chapter should be a stop on a well-planned route. All the steps in that route between destinations should be clear to the reader. The book will take people into territory where they've never been before. So the author needs to have a clear itinerary in mind, and they need to explain to readers so that they know where they're going and can keep up. Now, there are different types of tours. Some books, such as cookbooks or Bible dictionaries, are really like self-guided tours, where readers can choose their own itinerary. You pop in when you need a recipe, you pop in when you need some information from a Bible dictionary. Other books are partly self-guided tour and partly planned tour, such as a Bible commentary. You could read it all the way through in the way that the author set it out, or you could just pop in here and there for light on particular passages. Well, most topical books are really like fully guided tours. Some books, in these the reader is led along a well-planned itinerary that the author believes is interesting and important. In manuscripts of this kind, readers need to have a clear sense that the author is a competent guide. They need to feel the author knows where they're going, knows which sites are worth seeing, and is reliable to organise all the details and look after them well. Reading a book is really an act of faith. The reader puts themselves in the hands of the author, just as a traveller puts themselves in the hands of a tour operator. Now, most readers, like tourists, set off with a sense of excitement and anticipation when they pick up a book. Our job as editors is to do what we can to make sure the book isn't a disappointment. It's a big letdown if the reader's bored in the first chapter, or if they get lost along the way. So we can ask some key questions. Does the author take readers on a journey with a clear destination in mind and a sense of moving towards it? Does the author come across as a reliable, organised and inspiring guide? Does the itinerary serve the content well? Or does it jump all over the place? Can I, as an editor, suggest anything to organise the tour more effectively? For example, a different overall book structure, a reordering of chapters, splitting or combining chapters, etc. Remembering that the goal is always a smooth and fulfilling experience for the reader. Now, all tours are basically made up of three components. There's the departure, there's the actual travelling, and there's the arrival. At the start of any tour, the itinerary is laid out for the travellers, and in a manuscript, laying out the itinerary means that in some way you indicate right at the start what the book's about and what readers can expect from the journey. This is normally done in the preface and/or the introduction and chapter 1. These should give some kind of indication of a number of things: the book's content, the book's approach and format, the writing style or language register, the book's tone. The preface and or introduction are kind of like the pre-tour planning, and then the first chapter is actually setting out. The manuscript should do three things for a good departure. First of all, it should give a clear idea of the goal or purpose of the journey. That means highlighting that core, central, big idea of the book, what it's essentially about. It needs to be clear right from the start. Secondly, a good departure will make an intriguing promise of what the tour will deliver. we need to show, at the beginning, we need to show the reader why it's going to be worth their while to read this book. This is normally done through what is called the problem-promise dynamic. The first chapter needs to demonstrate a problem or a need that is compelling enough to warrant the reader's attention, and in some way promise the reader that they'll be rewarded with wisdom to meet that need or problem if they read the book. And here's an example of a book that does that. In fact, it doesn't even wait for the first chapter to do it. It does it on the front cover. What's the problem? When helping hurts. The problem is helping the poor can create hurt, both for them and for you. And the promise is this book will show you how to help effectively without creating hurt. And the third thing that, a book needs, departure needs to do is to set out an accurate map or itinerary of the route that the tour will take. This means the first chapter is setting a trajectory for the whole book. Now that map might be detailed, or it might be just a general indication of what the reader will find. Either way, the readers need to get an idea of the direction that the book will take so that they understand what they're signing up for. So key questions that you can ask. Are the introduction or first chapter a good indication of what the rest of the book is like? Is a clear itinerary, or at least a clear direction of travel, laid out at the start? Does the manuscript identify a need or problem and promise a benefit or solution? Is there a clear trajectory in the book, a planned route? Does the first chapter accurately indicate what's in store for the reader as they read on? After laying out the itinerary, the book actually needs to travel the journey. The goal is for the reader to feel that each chapter is moving them along this anticipated journey. So to travel well, a manuscript needs to do three things. First of all, stick to the itinerary. The itinerary and the actual trip need to match. This means we can't have the author wandering off on side trips or losing sight of the overall purpose. And if the author does go off on tangents, we either need to encourage them to cut that out or help them to see that they need to rework that material so that its relevance to the main journey is obvious. Secondly, the manuscript needs to travel, it needs to by treating each important stop on the journey well. Sometimes writers haven't thought through every aspect of their subject equally thoroughly, or they don't write about every aspect equally well. Sometimes they just simply run out of steam partway, and some of the writing is underdone. An author told me once, I'm reasonably happy with most of it, but I'm worried about chapter 7. It feels like it's an undergraduate essay. And he didn't know what to do about it. Well, he was absolutely right. So I suggested a whole pile of lines for further development. And the interesting thing about that is all those lines of development were actually implicit in what the author had already written. He just couldn't see them. And so I was able to draw them out so that he could see where his core thinking was able to go into new directions. And the third thing that the manuscript needs to do as it travels is it needs to maintain momentum. A reader needs to feel momentum in a book. Momentum means forward movement. It's not the same as speed. The speed of a car and the speed of say a bullock wagon are completely different, but in both of them, there's that feeling of forward movement. So whatever the book's speed, readers need to feel a sense of going somewhere, of making progress. In particular, they need to see as they go along that what they're reading is helping to fulfill the promise that was made back at the start of the book. So some key questions you can ask about travelling. Does the manuscript stick to the itinerary, or are there places where the author goes off map? Does the author miss any itinerary stops altogether? Is each aspect of the manuscript thought through carefully and treated well? Is any material underdone? Does the manuscript maintain a sense of momentum, or does it bog down? Finally, the manuscript needs to arrive. That means deliver on the promise. This delivery should be progressive. Alice Kreider again says that a manuscript should have lots of aha moments when the reader says, aha, I never knew that. That's a new thing. That's something I want to know more about. In other words, the fulfillment of a book's promise should build piece by piece as the reader goes along. And finally, there should be an overall sense of completion and satisfaction. Whether the author agrees, the reader agrees with the author's opinion or not, they need to feel that it's been well handled. So, does the book deliver what it promised? Are there aha moments? And after each chapter, you can ask, what's the payoff in this chapter for the reader? The final principle is the stepping stones principle. All content should follow a logical, easy to walk path. So staying with our tour metaphor for a moment, the next important question is, can the readers travel comfortably? In other words, does the manuscript flow smoothly? This idea of flow is an important one. Flow is about the elements of a manuscript connecting together like links in a chain or beads on a string. It's about chapter connecting to chapter, idea connecting to idea, and parts of a chapter forming a logical and clear pathway from the first sentence to the end. Flow concerns both the writing and the argument. Is the reader carried along in the sweep of the writing? Is the progression of thought clear so that what the writer is trying to say is communicated well? If the writing runs smoothly and the lines of argument run smoothly, lines of thought, then the reader's engagement will run smoothly. Now, flow applies to the book as a whole, to parts of the book, between chapters and within chapters. I want to concentrate on flow of content within chapters. This picture of stepping stones across a river is a useful way to think about chapter flow, connection and coherence. A book overall is like a big river, and the chapters are like stepping stones across it, but each chapter is also like a river, and the author needs to organise the content as a pathway of stones from one side to the other, so that the reader can make a successful crossing. By successful crossing, I mean that they get to the end of the chapter having followed the author's line of thought without confusion. When you're crossing a river, people look for the easiest way across. If there's a straight row of stones, that's the one that they'll take. If the stones are a bit higgledy-piggledy, clear pathway through is harder to see. And if there are big gaps between the stones, then people don't know what to do. Imagine the stepping stones as the steps of the argument. The reading experience should be like stepping from stone to stone, with each stone placed so that the reader can step easily from idea to idea without stumbling or getting lost. So in developmental editing, the author looks for problems with stepping stones. Some of those might be that there's no clear path through the chapter. In other words, the editor's ideas lie about without any clear order. The author's ideas. Sometimes stones, that is the points of the argument, may be out of sequence or lead off at a tangent. There can be missing stones between the stones that are already there. So gaps in the progression of thought that need to be supplied. Those gaps might be something as simple as a definition of a term that hasn't been defined before. Or it might be a whole slide in an argument where the steps between something that the author says and then the next thing they say aren't clear. Some of the stones might be unstable. That is, the points aren't well expressed, or there are dubious assertions, or there's a lack of evidence. And stones can sometimes leave the reader stranded. That is, they don't make their point clear, or they're confusing in some way. So the editor can suggest if there's a need to repair this stepping stone pathway across a chapter, the editor can suggest certain things. And the main three things are link, reorganise, and supplement. The main way that you ensure this smooth transition is through links and transitions between points. That is, enough stepping stones to make sure that the path is easy to follow. The goal is to avoid readers having to jump from idea to idea with sudden changes of direction and not knowing why, not seeing the connections. Transitions don't have to be complex. Often just a phrase or a sentence or a paragraph will do the trick. Another strategy to help create flow is to shift the stepping stones around, as it were. That is, reorganise the flow of the argument by repositioning material. For example, sometimes an author talks about the same theme in multiple places in the chapter. Sometimes it's appropriate to suggest that they bring all that material together in one place. This kind of rearranging can be done both within chapters and between chapters as well. And just one little tip, if you recommend moving material from one place to another, it's always important to explain that that material will need to be reworked as appropriate in the new context, not simply transferred verbatim. The third strategy you can use is to add extra material or supplement what's there. Developmental edit can help stabilise the stones, as it were, by suggesting that the author, for example, add some more helpful thoughts, reword a passage for clarity, or provide extra supporting rocks, such as brief explanations or evidence for their assertions, or definitions and so on. And depending on the kind of book, adding some subheadings can sometimes be a useful tool to bringing order and flow. Subheading scheme should be consistent throughout the manuscript. I find often that I have to help authors understand subheading levels and how they work. And if as an editor you don't know how subheadings work, I suggest that you go and find a book on editing and educate yourself. Subheadings are incredibly powerful, but they can also create a terrible mess if you don't know what you're doing. So, questions you can ask about the stepping stone principle issues: does the writing flow smoothly and the argument flow coherently? Does the chapter start well and make crossing the river look enticing? Is there a clear and logical stepping stone path through the chapter? Are there tangents that will lead the readers astray? Are there missing links or transitions that need to be added? Does any material need to be repositioned? Would an alternative chapter structure be better? Is the chapter complete, or are additional arguments or extra information needed? So in summary, developmental editing is about finding the optimum shape for a manuscript. That is, the most effective format for presenting its message. It looks for a solid core to the book, an easy to follow journey, a smooth reading experience, an overall clarity and unity. Now, this webinar, the Blurb for this webinar, said that developmental editing is the toughest job in editing. Well, whether it's the toughest job for you or not will depend on your particular skills and strengths. But for everybody, it's certainly a challenging job. It's challenging for the editor because it requires you to really know the manuscript from the inside out. You need to use strategies like making notes, diagramming chapter structures, drawing mind maps of chapter content, flow charts to understand the progression of thought. You need to understand well what's there before you suggest changing it. It requires sustained concentration, close analysis, creative thought, patience and care, and of course, diplomacy in working with the author. But for the author, developmental editing is also challenging because it requires openness to change and a willingness to work hard. But challenging as it is, ultimately, it is fulfilling because the result is a book that is more clearly written, better organised, and far more effective. And that's the end of the presentation. I'll just pop up here this last slide. These are the helpful videos that I referred to. If you scribble down the titles there, and you can just look for those on YouTube under the name of the person, the name of the talk, you'll find them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Owen. That's really a very good presentation on developmental editing. By the way, these videos, the titles of these webinars actually, or yeah, they can find this on YouTube and from MAI's YouTube channel. Yes. I could probably provide the link to these webinars when I send the link of the recording of this webinar to all those who registered. Thank you. I'm so glad to see interaction even in the chat. Thank you for your interactions there. And also, there was a comment on they were not really very familiar with the maypole idea, but I think you have. Could that be similar to a hub of a wheel?
Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. That would be another picture that would capture the same idea.
Yeah, because
everything needing to be connected to a central key idea.
That's right.
Or purpose.
That's right. So for those of us who are not familiar with the maypole, maybe a wheel with a central hub with the spokes connected to the hub. So that could be a good picture as well. Thank you. There's a question on, my question is, when do you want the writer to approach you, Owen? Should I have my core statement already, my objective and purpose of my book? Should I have my table of contents already and discuss it with you? When is the right time to see an editor for developmental edit?
I don't think there's any right, one answer to that. Every writer is an individual. Every situation is unique, really. The more that a writer has thought through what it is that they think they want to do, the better. They have something that they can bring to an editor and say, look, this is what I think that I want to do. That might be just a general idea. And the question that they come to an editor might be I don't know even how to start. They might not be a professional, but there might be a pastor and someone said to them, oh, your sermons are so fantastic, pastor, you should write a book. But they don't know how to begin. There might be something as simple as that. Or it might be someone who's thought it through. Perhaps they've taught material for a long time, or they've run seminars, or they've thought about an issue and they have an idea of where they want to begin, or but they're not sure exactly how to structure it, what would be of interest. Well, if they can bring that material to an editor could help them think about it. On the other end of the scale, of course, there are people who've thought about a book and will just come to an editor with a completed manuscript. From a developmental editing point of view, personally, I don't think it much matters from my point of view of my work as an editor, because I try to tailor my response to what I'm presented with.
I see.
If a person comes and they've barely started, then that's where I will start with them. And if the person comes with a completed manuscript or a first draft, then that's where I will start with them. That will be a more complex job, of course, because I'll need to then go and work through what they've done. I may need to talk with them. What are you trying to do? I get the feel for what you're doing. I don't feel it quite works. And everything's in between those areas. So if you're a writer, I would say, if you're wanting the help of an editor, have an idea of what you're wanting to do, but don't lock it in concrete.
Okay.
Come along and speak to somebody who you think might be able to advise you and see if they're any help.
Mm-hmm.
And then take it from there. Let it develop naturally as a relationship.
Well, I think one of the basic attitudes of a writer is humility, to be able to say, here's my idea, help me make it clearer. Because some writers are very stubborn and say, this is it. I don't want to change this anymore. Then it's not going to be helpful.
No, that's true, Ramon. And so the editor, one of the things I suggest in that supplementary material that I've sent you is sometimes the editor can actually play the publisher card. Mm-hmm. If you're doing the work for a publisher, you can come and say the author doesn't like your idea, perhaps for change, but it might be important from the publisher's point of view. The publisher might not be willing to have that in the book. And so you owe a duty to the publisher as well as to the author. You also owe a duty to the reader. So you can play the reader card. That's you can say, this is, you're happy with the way you've expressed this, but I'm coming to this, absolutely clean. I don't know what your thinking is. I've not talked to you. All I've got is your words on a page. And it's not making sense to me. And I can only assume that as a typical reader, they will have problems. So you can go into bat for the reader as well. You're representing all three, the author to help them, the reader to produce something they can understand, and the publisher to produce a good product.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all of your words of affirmation and encouragement in the chat. Thank you. There's a question here. How much does a developmental editor charge? Is that a different?
Yeah, I think that's probably a difficult question to answer because we all come from such different countries, different contexts, different publishing environments.
Yeah. Okay. Can you, from Susan Binian, can you recommend a good editing book that would include info on subheadings? A good editing book that would include.
Right. The one that comes to mind is one that you probably won't have much access to. That's the Australian Government Style Manual, which is the standard for publishing in public documents here in Australia, and is a good guide for a lot of publishing that's done here in Australia. But I would say the internet is lying there before you as a vast wonderland of possible wisdom about things like this. I did a quick Google while preparing this talk, and I found all sorts of interesting articles about developmental editing, some of them taking a perspective like the one that I've taken, others taking a slightly different angle on it, but all of them with something to offer. And I would say that, one of the things that I believe in a different context, when we're talking about what are the important qualities for an editor, one of them I would always mention is self-education, willingness to continue to educate yourself, to upskill yourself. And even though you may not have access to courses or even books, if you have access to the internet, you can find a wealth of material there that will help you learn things that you don't already know. And the use of subheadings would certainly fall into that category. I've not Googled the use of subheadings, but I would find creative ways to Google for particular things and see what comes up. It's a bit like bit like a what do they call a mystery dip? Like at school when the children go to school and they have a fair or a fete and they have a lucky dip and the children put their hand in and they pull out whatever, a little toy. Well, the internet is a little bit like that. You can find all sorts of things that will help you out there.
Thank you, Owen. I invite our audience, if you have questions, type in your questions at the Q&A. So yes, did we answer other questions that were typed on chat? Okay. What's the differences between the map idea and the stepping stones idea? Is there an overlap?
Well, there is an overlap, isn't there? When you think about, they're both about having a consistent journey that runs through and keeps the reader moving. The map idea is one that helps me often to explain to writers, your book needs to be like a map. Your chapters need to be like different destinations in that tour, so that they start to get this idea that the book overall needs to have some linkages between the material, and that they shouldn't just plonk a few ideas down and say, call it a book. It needs to be, woven together. The stepping stone idea is one that I use with authors particularly when they get all mixed up, or when they've got 35 different ideas in a chapter, but they're not carefully put together in a way which leads the reader through on a logical line of thought. So yes, the ideas are very similar. I use them when talking to authors about different problems to try and help clarify things in their mind as to what I'm after.
I like your forward movement analogy, because both stepping stones and the map, you are headed to a destination, you're moving forward. And that's a very helpful guide. By the way, Tim and Reggie are in North America, and it's very early morning here. Thank you, Tim. And for all of you who woke up in the middle of the night, thank you so much for being here. It's amazing. Okay, Susan is acknowledging this has been a very excellent webinar. Thank you. Any other question from the floor? Is it on developmental editing or editing in general? If you have a question that you would like to ask Owen. I like your big picture also, that you have a big picture, making sure that this is the process, like looking at the big picture, and the copy editing is trees in the forest, while you're looking at the forest as in developmental edit. Okay, I think we have answered all questions, and thank you for being here, all of you. Owen, please, we would like to hear from you, your final words of encouragement to our audience, to our friends.
I hope that you've got something out of the webinar today. Editing is a very high calling, in my view. It's a very I don't know quite what the word for it is. It's a very special calling, and it's not something that a lot of people can do well. And if you have a sense of God's call on your life to edit, then it's a call to servanthood, and a call to serve writers, to say what they want to say. Now, that you yourself personally have so little to say into the world. That's how I feel about myself. I have so little to say. But God has gifted me and called me in such a way that I can help many other people to say things which I could never say. And so I have a part to play in that. And I think sometimes people ask the question, what's the most important skill to have in editing? And for me, the most important skill is not a technical skill at all, but it's the spiritual skill, if you like, of being a disciple first and an editor second. Don't ever make the mistake of separating your editing from your discipleship. The most important lessons about editing that I have learned have had nothing to do with skills development or technical issues. They're all to do with my growth as a disciple, because editing requires wisdom, it requires empathy, it requires servanthood, it requires coming alongside people, it requires patience, all those things that the Holy Spirit builds into our life. They're the essential building blocks of an editor. On top of that, all the technical skills can be added. So I encourage you, whatever your situation is, and especially if it sometimes feels a bit discouraging, press on, because what you're doing is so important.
Thank you so much, Owen. Thank you for reminding me that that is exactly the question of Vika Rahilia of Indonesia. And you just answered that question. What is the most important skill to have in editing? And as you said, your discipleship and your growth as a follower of Jesus tops whatever technical skills you may have as an editor. And you're coming.
I might just say one last quick comment. Sometimes about technical skills, something that is often forgotten when talking about technical skills is the foundation underneath, the technical foundation underneath technical skills, and that is you have to love your language.
Okay.
You have to love your language. Whatever language it is, whether it's English or some other language, whatever language you're working in, an editor needs to love that language, needs to care about it, care about how it's used, care about how it's effectively used, care about making sure that that language is right. Because as an editor, a lot of people are relying on you to get it right.
Yes. Yes.
And one of the first commandments you sometimes find in books or articles or whatever, or seminars, sometimes people will say the first commandment of editing is do no harm. And it's very easy to do harm to someone else's manuscript. And it's very easy to do harm to someone else personally by the way that we go about our job. And so I would say, love your language, study it, master it, and then build your technical skills on that.
Amen. Amen. Thank you very much, Owen. This has really been very helpful, and I hope this webinar is helpful to all of you who attended the webinar. Yes, and this is recorded, and we will send you the link to the recording so you can view it again and pass, and even forward the link of the webinar to your friends and colleagues. So again, thank you very much, Owen, for lending your expertise and experience and for helping us. And thank you so much for everyone who attended this webinar. We hope to see you again in the next webinar next month. We will send you the invitation to that webinar. So God bless everyone, and thank you for being with us today.